Greetings and welcome there, academic proletariat, to this episode of the Fireside Chats with Mr. Olson, where we will be talking about the most depressing decade in American history. Anyways, we're going to subtitle this one A Crisis of Confidence for reasons that you'll see in a second. All right, so let's set the stage here and do a little bit of contextualization. Hopefully you remember that at the end of the 1960s, there was some chaos, especially encompassed by the year 1968, where a lot of things went wrong. Well, we'll get to those things that went wrong in a second, but just to remind you that out of the mess that was the mid to late 1960s, there grew a austere, draconian group that sort of wielded all the power in America. That group is known as the Silent Majority. It was given the name by Richard Nixon, whom this group voted for in droves in the 1968 election, and ultimately put him in the White House. This silent majority consists mainly of white and middle class black Americans, so white Americans and middle class black Americans, mostly people who are upset with rioting, that are disgusted by the counterculture and their wearing of sandals and long hair and, inability or unwillingness to bathe. They're nervous about the decadent nature of society. They see society going down the pipes, and they want to retain their position in society, so they vote for the status quo candidate, Richard Nixon. Now, a lot of this was brought on by the chaos, as we said before, that was 1968. 1968 was a year that saw Martin Luther King Jr. get assassinated, Robert F. Kennedy, the leading Democratic nominee for president, get assassinated, the Tet Offensive, which showed Americans that the Vietnam War was not going well, a Democratic National Convention in Chicago that ended up in a riot, and young protesters getting beaten up by the police on the streets of our great city, and the election of Richard Nixon. Now, globally, there were European uprisings, there were uprisings in Latin America. Nevertheless, 1968 set the stage for the 1970s and its problems. So let's go ahead and just continue on this background for a second and remind you that there were some deep foundations in conservatism that were growing up during the 1960s and the 1950s. Everybody wants to celebrate the 1950s for its consensus and its conformity, and then assume that the 1960s was this sort of backlash against conformity. And while that's true, there was a large contingent of Americans that stayed true to the consensus of the 1950s. So even though they weren't, at the forefront of what we remember and how the 1960s are usually portrayed, conservatives were there, and they were there ready to make their move. Now, this conservatism is one that you'll recall from other epochs in American history and at other time periods. So let's characterize it, and hopefully you see the parallels. This conservatism embraces the free market and questions big government. These two things taken together can be what we consider now a neoliberal government, which basically means applying classical economics, which is small government, free markets. That's how you're going to get the best society. These are people and groups that hate the New Deal welfare state. They cannot stand the expansion of government that occurred under the New Deal. They're hesitant to support civil rights because they see it as having worn out its welcome. They're deeply patriotic. They mostly favor whatever American troops do. If they are disliking the war in Vietnam, they're going to do so honorably. So they're going to say that they don't support the war, but they support the troops, which is kind of like a riding the fence mechanism that doesn't take a side at all. They dislike anti-war protesters, and they cannot stand civil rights protesters who have gotten themselves on the news. They celebrate nuclear family values and virtue. They want candidates who are tough on crime, which, as it happens, is just code for tough on black people. Now, this movement begins with the nomination of Barry Goldwater as the Republican candidate in 1964. Now, this is an important one to make note of, because usually we don't talk about losers, and hopefully you remember that the 1964 election was a landslide. Lyndon Johnson won because his Great Society programs were incredibly popular, but the Republicans in 1964 had a choice. Do they go with a liberal Republican like New Yorker Nelson Rockefeller, or do you go with hardcore Arizona conservative, nuke everybody in Asia, Barry Goldwater? They picked Barry Goldwater in 1964, signaling to us that the conservative tide was on. Anyways, this is best exemplified by the fact that Richard Nixon was successful in being elected in 1968. So let's tell this story through maps. Hopefully, you recall that the 1950s ended with the 1960 election, which was very, very close and indicated that America wasn't necessarily on the same page politically. Anyways, John F. Kennedy won because a bunch of people in Chicago who were dead voted for him, and anyways, he's swept in. Then, in 1964, because he was carrying the torch for a martyred president, Lyndon Johnson easily wins over Barry Goldwater. But it is important to know that Barry Goldwater sets the foundation for this massive conservative movement, which makes me think that hopefully other people that lose their bid to be the president might set a movement in motion that's good for the rest of America. So, again, these conservatives embrace a free market, they hate big government, and they especially dislike the New Deal and Great Society states that had come about. So now, this brings us to Richard Nixon, who in 1968 wins in an electoral landslide, but if you look at the popular vote, it's very, very close. Now, this is very, very close because this third party candidate, one George Wallace, stole a lot of votes away from Richard Nixon. Now, what was going on in the 1968 election that would lead to so many Democrats losing votes? Or the Democrats losing so many votes, I should say. Well, of course, the war in Vietnam was dragging on, and people weren't upset or weren't happy with that one. And the Democrats just could not put forth a reliable candidate. They choose Hubert Humphrey, whose name should say it alone. Not a lot of good stock in the Democratic Party. Nevertheless, Richard Nixon wins despite his third-party push from segregationist Alabama governor George Wallace. And so Richard Nixon finally gets what he wants. He becomes the president. And he becomes the president who was voted in by all of the people that wanted small government, free markets, and taking down the New Deal and Great Society welfare state. Well, when Richard Nixon gets in office, he increases the size of the federal government. He puts in place OSHA, which keeps you safe on the job site. He puts in place the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. By the way, I'm filming this on Earth Day. He appoints Warren Burger as Chief Justice to the Supreme Court, who leads a rights revolution in the Supreme Court, thus giving more rights to groups of Americans like criminals and civil rights leaders, Black Americans, Latin Americans, expands rights exponentially. He also declares a war on cancer. What kind of president looking for a smaller government declares a war on cancer? I just don't get it. All right, so anyways, Nixon's presidency is probably most positively remembered for his foreign policy. He was a foreign policy champ in some ways. In Vietnam, if you recall, he offered initially a secret plan, but then turned to Vietnamization, which was going to be turning over the war to the Vietnamese to fight on their own, which he successfully does with the help of his sadistic and evil national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. This results in the last Treaty of Paris of the year 1973. Oh, we've been through 4.5 Treaty of Paris, and here we are at the very end. Anyways, that's going to end American involvement. Eventually, the Americans will withdraw from Vietnam in 1975, and it will be left to the Vietnamese. Now, between the Soviet Union and the United States, Richard Nixon institutes a period known as détente, or thawing. The Cold War tensions that had risen under Dwight D. Eisenhower and had come to a boiling point under Kennedy were starting to thaw out a little bit because of Richard Nixon's very savvy, tactician-like moves in foreign policy. He travels to China. He goes to the Soviet Union. He signs an arms limitation treaty. He is very, very cunning in his ability to play foreign powers against each other. For example, when he goes to China and shakes hands with Mao, what do you think the Russians are thinking? Well, then he visits Russia and he talks to Leonid Brezhnev, the premier of the Soviet Union. What do you think the Chinese are thinking? Anyways, this Richard Nixon, he is playing both these teams against one another in a game that we like to call Nixon Gammon. Whatever. Okay, the rest of this presentation is going to be organized by way of several problems that America faced during the 1970s. We open this up by reminding you that the 1970s was a hilariously depressing decade, so let's get to it. Well, problem number one occurs under Richard Nixon, and it pertains to secrets in Vietnam. Remember, Nixon pledged a secret plan to end the war, but after he does that, he actually increases and ramps up bombing in Cambodia. Now, this is really unfortunate because the bombing of the U.S. bombs in Cambodia destabilized the Cambodian government, thus allowing a renegade communist group called the Khmer Rouge, led by psycho Pol Pot, to come to power, who genocide and massacre up to 1/4 of the Cambodian population. Anyways, if you know one named Ryan Stubish, go find him because he likes to talk about Pol Pot. Okay, anyways, as a result of these secret bombings, and the word eventually got out, as secrets usually do, there were students throughout America that staged protests. The most important protest occurs at Kent State University in Akron, Ohio on May 4th, 1970. Well, the students engage in this protest, and the Ohio National Guard gets called out, and things peacefully develop from there. There are the protesters. Here comes the guard. There come the tear gas, and then people die. 5 people on whole get shot, and it just goes to show that Americans, well, they got some issues. They got some issues. Problem number 2, Watergate. This one's kind of a complicated one because it's so unfathomable. You can't even envision it happening. Now, even though Richard Nixon had his issues with secrets in Vietnam, overall he had high approval rating because conservatives liked him because of the rhetoric he used, and people that were kind of in the middle or moderate voters liked him because he wasn't necessarily doing away with the New Deal or Great Society portions that people actually liked. So in 1972, whoa, he wins in a landslide. Now, this is as landslidey as they're going to get. Just about as landslidey as the 1984 election, which we'll talk about next time. Now, you look at this election map and you think the last thing that the person who won had to do was cheat. Well, they did. Yeah, they did. Anyways, Richard Nixon had this organization called CREEP, hilariously named, by the way. It's an acronym that stands for the Committee to Re-elect the President. I don't know how you would come up with that acronym for that group, but that's just me. Anyways, this group, who was committed to re-electing the president, broke into his opponent's campaign office to try and dig up dirt on George McGovern. Well, they got caught because of Forrest Gump or other reasons, and after they got caught, the media picked it up, the Washington Post ran with it, and Nixon had to make a decision. Do I admit that I knew about this, or do I not? He didn't know about it when it happened, but afterwards he knew about it, and then he decides to cover it up and pay off those who know. Now, the really unfortunate thing for Nixon, who on the character side was a psychotic, paranoid man, he had installed taping systems throughout the White House, which taped every conversation that he had. This paranoia was epic, second to none. And so he had all the conversations taped, and so they went through the tapes and found, among other things, that many of them were very, very naughty. He swore all the time. He was anti-Semitic. He was anti-Army. He was anti-Harvard. And so those tapes got out. They typed them all up and showed the public that the President of the United States had a potty mouth. Well, the nuclear family 1950s aren't going to like that. So, they kind of took that to Nixon, and eventually he's forced to resign. Actually, he's more forced to resign because there was a short 18-and-a-half-minute part of the tapes that was missing, which they probably, they reasonably assumed that Richard Nixon was the one who admitted to knowing something about it there. Anyways, he's forced to resign, and taking over for him is one Gerald Ford, who is probably the most forgettable president ever. Why? Because the first thing he does is pardons Nixon. A pardon is when the sitting president absolves any criminal of charges, thus letting them off the hook. That is an incredibly unpopular move in America, and therefore Gerald Ford, he goes down in the books as being kind of a clumsy oaf. Now, problem number 3 is the struggling economy. We knew it was going to happen because capitalism, thrives on ebbs and flows and ups and downs, and the 1970s are going to hit a deep deep down. Now, the first phenomenon, and the one that you probably are least likely to hear about because it's still affecting your lives and people don't want you to know that it does, is deindustrialization. This is a process by which factories move out of the Midwest and the Northeast and to places like the South or overseas. Now, why would factories in the Northeast or Midwest move? Well, first thing is mechanization. We don't need as many workers near where products are sold because we have airplanes and trucks and things that can travel more easily. But also, we don't need as many workers. So if we don't need as many workers, let's go find some places where the workers don't necessarily have that much power. Let's search for low wages, and because we have improved transportation, we can do that. Well, where can you find low waged workers who are low skill, which doesn't matter because we have machines now, and it doesn't matter if it's far away or not because we have better transportation. Well, the South and overseas are where they go. Now, what happens as a result of this deindustrialization process? Well, if you're turning everything into a machine, you lose jobs. If you're looking for low-wage, unskilled workers, unions lose all their power. So what we see is the rise of an area of America known as the Rust Belt. Those would be the city or states like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, kind of Illinois, but not really because Chicago's on the way back. But these are places that used to have a lot of factories that now don't and are struggling to find themselves, and sometimes they make really, really bad election decisions, if you know what I mean. Anyways, so the Rust Belt is in the Midwest, but all those factories got to go somewhere. Many of them move to the South and the Southwest to an area that becomes known as the Sun Belt because they get all the jobs and more people because now they have air conditioning. The other thing is outsourcing, which I know is a phenomenon that hopefully you've covered in other classes, so we're not necessarily going to belabor that point too. Now, the second thing that causes economic panic in the 1970s is two, yes, not one, two oil crises. In 1973, oh, by the way, I'm recording this video on a date that the price of oil in America is less than $0. Go ahead and figure that out. Capitalism, what a disaster. Okay, so in response to American aid to Israel, Middle Eastern countries enact an oil embargo, which means they're not going to sell it to some places. Now, this increases gas prices, which increases prices on everything else. It also decreases the gas supply, so that's why you would see gas stations with signs that said, sorry, we're out of gas. Go somewhere else. Today, there are gas stations begging people to buy their gas because there is so much. Back then, in 1973, the gas supply so low that gas stations ran out. There was a second one in 1979 that was caused by a panic that resulted from the Iranian Revolution. Oil sellers freaked out. Oil prices increased again, and you get lines because there's an oil shortage of cars around the block. Ask your parents about that one because I bet they remember. Now, there are also problems related to Great Society spillover. If you don't recall, the Great Society vastly expanded social welfare programs and vastly expanded the size and scope of the federal government, but did so by not raising taxes. It did so by trying to lessen taxes on people in hopes that their buying would just stimulate the economy. Well, that doesn't really help here. So what we get is increased unemployment because people aren't buying stuff, high inflation, prices are going up because the price of oil is going up, and that means we get the worst cocktail ever, stagflation, high unemployment and high inflation, which means a lot of people without jobs and high prices. Those two things do not go well together. Anyways, these two things undermine people's confidence in the government to make good decisions, especially economic ones, which means Uncle Sam is essentially problem number 4. We have civil rights issues that are continuing because unfortunately the I Have a Dream speech just did not fix everything. So issue number 1, how do you integrate schools? Because even though Brown versus the Board of Education was supposedly desegregated them, you still have black students going to school in this one and white students going to school in this one. How do you fix that? Well, the Supreme Court orders that students from predominantly black schools are bused to integrate predominantly white schools. Now, this causes a huge backlash from white working class communities, particularly in Boston, and as a result of that one, you get a lot of uncomfort with the direction of the civil rights movement. Then that's why several Democratic supposedly working class politicians from places like, I don't know, Delaware, named, I don't know, Joe Biden, would have this terrible record on civil rights and busing because he did not advocate for this process. The other thing that causes a lot of hubbub in terms of civil rights issues is affirmative action. Affirmative action is basically using anti-discrimination tactics to make sure that jobs are equally offered to people of various backgrounds. Okay, so this could be, hiring certain minorities for certain jobs if they have the same credentials as a white candidate in an effort to try and make the workplace diverse. Now, this is certainly necessary if you are going to fight against structural racism. However, putting all your eggs in the affirmative action basket might not be the wisest decision. In 1978, there was a landmark Supreme Court case, UC Berkeley versus Bakke, which said that race can be used as admission criteria, but that quotas are not allowed. And by quota, we mean if 10% of the population is black, then 10 of the city's 100 firefighters have to be black too. That was ruled against. Now, the problem there is that since white Americans enjoy a material advantage over black Americans, then black Americans will not be able to achieve at the same levels as white Americans. So these affirmative action policies, they might not find enough qualified black applicants. So you have to structurally fix the economy in order to make those things come to fruition. All right, so moving on, civil rights issues also blew up in the realm of women's advance for rights, best exemplified by the landmark Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade in 1971, which ruled that a woman had a right to privacy and had a right to have an abortion in the first trimester. Now, this is one that obviously can get very dicey, and the conversation can grow incredibly animated. And so it's important to note that this was a process. It's not like the Supreme Court just handed down Roe versus Wade. The birth control pill became widespread in the 1960s, and there was a Supreme Court case called Griswold versus Connecticut that said that contraception was legal and no state could bar a woman from using it, and so they just take that one step further. Additionally, the Equal Rights Amendment, which had been proposed actually in the 19-teens by Alice Paul, makes a comeback. This is an amendment that proposes to provide equal treatment to men and women, equal pay, equal treatment under the law, no differences whatsoever. Well, this beautiful little lady right here, Phyllis Schlafly, who has one of the most evil names in history, is one of the foremost arguers against the Equal Rights Amendment. She argues against it on the basis that women will have to go to bathrooms and use the same potties as men, and women will have to go fight in Vietnam, and it will destroy the sanctity of a woman's role as wife and mother. If you take those things away from her, she will be worthless. And so you get the 1970s version of Catherine Beecher arguing in 1840. Nevertheless, these arguments don't necessarily go away. Not all women thought that the Equal Rights Amendment was a good thing. Anyways, the Equal Rights Amendment came one state short of voting or being ratified. And if you look, Phyllis Schlafly was from none other than Illinois, which did not ratify. Problem number 5, we move on to random isolated proper noun, Jimmy Carter. Now, because of all of the mess that had occurred with Richard Nixon and Watergate and Gerald Ford pardoning Nixon and whatever, it was probably a foregone conclusion that nobody was, or that the Republicans were not going to win. And as you can see here in the election in 1976, they don't. It's a reasonably close election, but Ford is defeated by relatively unknown Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer turned governor of Georgia, now becomes the president. Now, he's probably one of the least effective presidents for several reasons. First of all, he took a lot of walks. Second of all, he jogged. He spent his time helping his kid with her homework. All of these things just got in the way of Carter doing a good job. And when faced with the task of helping a struggling economy, Carter just didn't know what to do. So he's president probably at one of the worst times one could find themselves being president. And by 1978, 2 years into his presidential administration, his approval rating had dropped to a dismal 28%. Carter is seen as a weak leader, and he's seen as a weak leader for several reasons. One of them being he unsuccessfully stands up to the Iranians during the hostage crisis, which we'll get to in a second. He does nothing about the Soviets invading Afghanistan, even though his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, tried to pull Poland, orchestrated the entire thing. But nevertheless, the poor economy, Carter being seen as weak, these things lead to Americans sort of having a lack of confidence in their government. Whenever America has a lack of confidence in their government, it usually leads to a conservative backlash, which, well, it's coming. Anyways, Carter wants to address this, and on July 15th, 1979, he delivers what he calls the Malaise speech. If you want to read the whole thing, you can pause it and read it, but I just want to read you this one part. Let me give you some context. He got together just by randomly calling people in the phone book, some Americans, and asked them how they felt. And this is the conclusion that he came to. Basically saying that we Americans are in a crisis. We can see that this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. Loss of meaning in our lives, loss of meaning in our nation. In other words, whose fault is that? Well, that's your fault. You're the problem. You need to shape up your attitude, have a better attitude, and then things will get better. Jimmy Carter, not so good. Bonus problem, disco. Obviously, if you've ever heard it, you would know disco is a problem. Problem number 6, we've got serious issues with our environment. Years of pollution and factory usage and fossil fuels and dumping of chemical waste has finally caught up with us. There's a couple of incidents from the late 1970s that really illustrate this. Well, since America decided in some cases to move to nuclear power in an effort to try and stave off environmental catastrophe, we built nuclear power plants, and one was called 3 Mile Island, and it was in Pennsylvania. Well, just so happened that in 1979 there was an accident in 3 Mile Island, and there was a near nuclear meltdown the size of Chernobyl. Nevertheless, it was narrowly averted, but still indicated that America and its relationship with the environment, not necessarily perfect. The other and more hilarious example of environmental issue occurred in a New York neighborhood named Love Canal. Love Canal was unfortunately built on an industrial waste site left over from the Gilded Age, and people there were getting sick. All the kids of Love Canal were getting sick, so the parents started to figure out why, and they figured that there was this huge chemical waste deposit that was running through the neighborhood. Well, the residents of Love Canal called the government and said, "You need to move us." The government said no, and when they sent an EPA inspector out to talk to the citizens of Love Canal, the citizens held the EPA member hostage until they got what they wanted. That is an epic example of Americans sticking up for their rights and non-violently protesting and getting what they want. Nevertheless, environmental issues catching up with America. And last but not least, problem number 7, the Iranian hostage crisis. What is probably the biggest foreign policy disaster of the 1900s. Well, I guess that's probably not correct to say because there were 2 world wars. But in the post-war era, what's probably the biggest foreign policy disaster, there are several Americans that are taken hostage in the Iranian capital during the Iranian Revolution. Now, they're taken hostage because America made a fateful decision to support the Shah of Iran, who was an autocratic, totalitarian dictator type, because America usually sides with them during this time period. And the Iranians get mad when the Shah, their old leader, seeks asylum in America to treat his cancer. And when America lets him in, the young Iranians revolt, and there are several Americans taken hostage. Anyways, America tries to save them, and here. Iranians take over the U.S. embassy, and they're angry about Jimmy Carter being friendly with the Shah, as we said before. The Iranians want Ayatollah Khomeini, who is Islamic fundamentalist cleric to be their leader. Well, the American hostages are taken hostage for 444 days. Now, in the middle of that, Operation Eagle Claw is a rescue attempt that hilariously fails. Now, this just goes to show that America not only can be intimidated and manipulated by a developing world and rather new government, but it also shows that we are sort of falling off in our ability to dominate everybody else. Now, to make matters worse, there is one news broadcaster named Walter Cronkite who, during the crisis, ends every episode of his TV show with, and that's the this number day of the Americans held hostage in Iran. This only added to the frustration and the lack of confidence that America had in Jimmy Carter, and that means that they go conservative in 1980 and they bring in Ronald Reagan. We'll talk about him